So he is walking in with a tremendous amount of leverage because China has their backs against the wall due to Iran. And here, of course, President Trump is departing. He is walking down the stairs of Air Force One onto Chinese soil here, exiting for his historic 2-day trip. And here also we're seeing, as John pointed out, young Chinese citizens who are waving the flags of both the United States and China as President Trump makes his way down Air Force One. But Alex, just going back to my question to you, with Iran, we did hear from Xi Jinping saying that no, China is not helping the war in Iran. Of course, there were reports that said otherwise. Can you elaborate a little bit on those reports? Because President Trump wants to quell some of those fears with the American public that no, he actually has a good handle on Xi Jinping and his actions when it comes to the war in Iran.
You know, sometimes we look at a lot of these developments in isolation and we don't think too much about it. But when we look at what's happened with Panama, with Venezuela, what's currently happening with Cuba, these are all things that speak to trying to purge Chinese influence from the Western Hemisphere. It's something that President Trump has nicknamed the Donroe Doctrine, of course, mocking, or I guess a play on the Monroe Doctrine, which is trying to expel outside influence from America's sphere of influence. So when we saw what President Trump did with the Panama Canal, he tried to remove China's influence from the Western Hemisphere. We saw what happened with Venezuela. Once again, a country that was very sympathetic to Russia and China, not only when it came to their oil exports, but oftentimes even when it came to some military equipment being shipped to South America. And now we look at what's happening with Cuba. Once again, the country under oil blockade, purging Russia and Chinese influence from the Western Hemisphere. This all plays into a larger strategy, and I think we're seeing that play out right here. Even the Iran situation once again plays to that. The United States wants to have energy dominance. They want to have control over the world's oil market to a large degree, which is what President Trump was really trying to do in Venezuela. And now he has a $40 trillion oil reserve where the United States is trying to figure exactly what to do with that. All of that plays into this larger concept of trying to expel Chinese influence from the Western Hemisphere. And now we see President Trump, of course, in China. Those are dynamics that Xi Jinping recognizes, and that puts China in that vulnerable position where now they need to, for example, end the war in Iran because they're dependent on strictly that source of oil reserve. They're no longer getting their imports from Venezuela the same way they were. They no longer have this strong ally right off 90 miles off the coast of Florida. All of these dynamics playing out right here.
Yeah, and as you can see, the president walking on the red carpet, followed by members of his family, members of his cabinet as well. I believe I see Elon Musk there in the background. And Alex, I just want to ask you for your opinion on this. Yes, America is strong and will remain strong and dominant. However, especially the consumers heavily rely on cheap imports from China. So can you talk about the connectivity, the mutual dependence, because China also buys a large amount of U.S. treasuries?
Yeah, well, when we talk about China being an authoritarian communist regime, that is, of course, true. But the reason why the Chinese economy has grown so much, primarily since the 70s and 80s, is because they have opened up their markets primarily to the United States, but the rest of the world, for that matter. So, yes, they are a communist country, but they've really relied on, I'll call it capitalism, but of course we know that it's more of a crony type of capitalism inside of China. But nonetheless, it's the idea that they're largely dependent on exports in order to drive their economy. The United States, on the other hand, is very largely dependent on imports, and that is something that President Trump has taken a little bit of issue with. The whole point of implementing his tariffs was to soar back manufacturing in the United States, saying that it's actually a national security concern for us to be so dependent not only on labor from overseas, but these products from overseas. We just had to go back a few years ago to the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. You remember that pharmaceutical supplies were very short in the opening days because we were so reliant on China in particular. Now, John, extrapolate that to other things. Say, for example, it came to chips, something that is in all of our technologies nowadays. Say it was in energy. Once again, something that President Trump wants to become more independent on. If we are reliant on other countries for those things, we are putting ourselves and essentially our security in the hands of those other countries.
Right.
By President Trump implementing these tariffs, which will come up in these conversations, they're attempting to take out that threat and bring it back to the United States.
Information. Truth is freedom. Is Newsmax. It's real news for real people.